Gimpy. That's what he called her in his head the moment she limped through the trauma bay doors at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, favoring her left leg as she clocked into her 12th consecutive hour at Sacred Heart in Norfolk. Dr. Marcus Caldwell watched from the surgical wing observation window, filing away the slight irregularity in her gait like a predator noting which gazelle moved slowest. He didn't see the way Ashley Cooper positioned herself, always angled 45 degrees to maximize reach toward the crash cart, always one calculated step ahead of the next code. He didn't see the woman whose hands moved with surgical precision through foot placements, the same hands that once performed field amputations under mortar fire in Marjah while shrapnel screamed overhead and men screamed louder. The antiseptic smell of the trauma bay wrapped around Ashley like a familiar shroud as she pushed through the double doors, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended. Her trauma scrubs hung loose enough to hide the prosthetic beneath, a titanium and carbon fiber miracle that cost more than most people's cars and moved with enough fluidity that only the slight hesitation in her gait betrayed its presence. 20 years she'd spent erasing Major Ashley Cooper, Army Nurse Corps, burying her alongside Tom in Arlington Cemetery, erasing the decorations and the deployments and the woman who could keep a man's heart beating in her hands when everything else failed. Sacred Heart knew only a civilian nurse with a barely perceptible limp who worked double shifts without complaint and never spoke about the life before the hospital lights. The nurse's station hummed with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday night, 3 monitors displaying vital signs from beds that hadn't seen empty space in 16 hours, coffee cooling in styrofoam cups decorated with fingerprints and exhaustion, and the rhythmic beeping of machines that never quite fell into a pattern. Ashley logged into the computer at Station 3, her credentials displaying her name and licensure but nothing of the security clearances that still technically remained in some classified government file, still technically active, still technically dormant. A single dog tag lay on the laminate counter beside the discharge paperwork, half hidden under a stack of transfer orders. The metal caught the fluorescent light and Ashley's fingers froze mid-keystroke. The chain was broken, the tag dented, and the number stamped into it belonged to someone she'd pulled from a burning compound in Kandahar province 12 years ago, a 7-year-old boy whose name she'd never learned and whose face she'd never forgotten. She picked up the tag without moving her jaw, without changing her breathing pattern, without letting the tremor that wanted to live in her hands actually arrive there. The lost and found log required an entry, source, date, description. Ashley wrote in the neat, economical script of someone trained to document field wounds and survival, 1 military identification tag, broken chain, approximate value $2. Transfer patient from 3 East. She sealed it in a plastic evidence bag, the kind used for contaminated materials, and filed it away where she could see it but no one would look. Ashley. The voice came from behind her left shoulder, measured and professional and carrying the weight of authority that Dr. Marcus Caldwell wore like a cologne that never quite fit. He was 43, educated at Johns Hopkins and Georgetown, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His tie was Italian silk. His shoes were handmade. His contempt for the nursing staff was so carefully calibrated that it never quite crossed into actionable disrespect. I need you on a medication verification for bed 4. Doctor's orders. Ashley turned from the computer without hesitation, her posture shifting into the particular stance of deference that had kept her employed and invisible for 2 decades. Of course, doctor. What's the medication? 500 milligrams for push of doxorubicin for the patient in 4. He said it with the casual certainty of a man who'd never questioned his own knowledge, who'd never had to. The words landed in the air between them like stones dropped into still water. Stat. The world didn't tilt. Ashley's pupils didn't dilate. She didn't feel the adrenaline spike that wanted to live in her bloodstream. Instead, she simply looked at the medication order on the screen, doxorubicin, a chemotherapy agent, a drug that required careful cardiac monitoring and precise weight-based dosing. The patient in bed for was Margaret Henley, 72 years old, admitted 6 hours ago for complications following treatment for aggressive breast cancer. The last cardiac echo on file was 4 weeks old. The current for access was a standard peripheral line, not a central line. The ordered dose was roughly triple the recommended weight-based standard for her body surface area. Doctor, Ashley said, her voice steady and quiet, the kind of quiet that made residents stop what they were doing and listen. Bed 4's cardiac function hasn't been assessed in 4 weeks. The doxorubicin dose exceeds BSA-adjusted protocol by approximately 2.8 times. A peripheral line pushes that higher concentration in that shorter window creates significant risk of extravasation and myocardial toxicity. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Caldwell's face darkened, not the flush of anger, but the deeper color of humiliation spreading beneath his skin like a stain. A resident named Sanchez, who'd been standing 2 feet away pretending not to listen, turned from the supply cabinet and looked directly at Ashley instead of at the chief of surgery. That was the real weapon. Not the correction. The fact that authority had shifted in that moment, that a resident had just learned which person in the room actually knew something. "The order stands," Caldwell said, his voice compressed into something hard and angular. "I'm the chief of surgery here, not you." Ashley's jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't narrow. She simply nodded, that small economical movement that meant nothing and everything, and returned to the computer terminal. "I'll need the order clarified in the system. The current dose won't process through safety protocols without attending physician override and documented justification." She watched him leave, the particular stiffness in his shoulders, the angle of his head, the way his hands formed fists for just long enough to be noticeable. Dr. Caldwell moved through the corridor like something that had been wounded and was trying very hard not to limp. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that particular sound that only you heard when everything else went quiet, and Ashley logged back into her work without breaking her breathing pattern, without letting the weight of what she'd just done settle into the space where her military identity lived. The night shift moved like a river around her, patients admitted and monitored and improved or declined, families arriving with emergency faces, doctors making rounds with the particular confidence of people who'd never had to question whether their orders killed people. Ashley moved through it all with the kind of invisible competence that made her dangerous to people like Caldwell. She caught a medication error on bed 7, an airway positioning issue on bed 10, a subtle sign of sepsis on bed 3 that the attending had nearly missed. Each correction was made with deference, each observation framed as a question, each intervention offered as a suggestion. By 2 a.m. her competence had accumulated into something undeniable, and the residents had started asking her things before they asked the attending. At 4 a.m., during the lull before the dawn surge, Ashley sat in her car in the parking lot outside Sacred Heart and let the wait arrive. She drove to Arlington National Cemetery in the pre-dawn darkness, the rain starting around the time she crossed the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, and by the time she reached Tom's grave the sky had opened into something that hammered against the windshield like applause for a performance nobody wanted to give. She stood in the rain without an umbrella because umbrellas implied the possibility of staying dry, and pressed her palm against the headstone that read Thomas Michael Cooper, Major, Army Nurse Corps, 1982 to 2009, beloved husband, hero. "I caught Caldwell today," she said to the wet granite, to the man buried beneath it, to the version of herself that had died when the IED detonated in Marjah. "Dangerous dosing. Could have killed her. I had to correct him. Had to. You know I had to." The rain fell harder. A maintenance truck drove past on the cemetery road, headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights across a landing zone. Ashley's hands, which had learned to keep people alive in the worst places on earth, hung at her sides. The prosthetic leg beneath her jeans ached in that particular way that meant weather was coming, that meant pressure systems shifting, that meant her body still remembered the explosion even if her face never showed it. She stood there until her clothes were soaked through, until the rain had washed away the fluorescent light glow of the hospital, until the darkness felt less like absence and more like homecoming. Then she drove back toward Norfolk, toward Sacred Heart, toward the next shift that would begin in 4 hours, toward the continuing work of erasing herself one corrected medication order at a time. But before she reached the hospital, the radio crackled with a dispatch. "Incoming trauma. Multiple GSW. ETA 7 minutes." The code alert would go live any moment, and every trained person at Sacred Heart would respond to the sound of emergency like dogs hearing a whistle. Ashley's hands, without her permission, began running through the mental checklist of pre-trauma setup, blood product count, OR availability, anesthesia readiness, backup medications at the bedside. The woman who didn't exist anymore was waking up inside the nurse who'd been trying so carefully to sleep. What happened in the next 3 hours would change nothing that had come before it, would explain nothing to the people watching, and would cost Ashley everything she'd built in 20 years of careful invisibility. The overhead page crackled at 2:51 p.m. Gimpy to the OR, stat. The words hung in the medication room like poison gas. Ashley's hand stilled on the syringe she was preparing, her fingers wrapped around the barrel with the kind of grip that comes from 20 years of practice, steady, precise, utterly controlled. 3 floors of Sacred Heart heard it. The pharmacy techs heard it. The residents rotating through heard it. And in that medication room on the 4th floor, every single nurse present felt their spine straighten in sympathetic anger. No one moved toward her. That was the thing about Caldwell's cruelty, it was surgical. It didn't require witnesses to perform, it required an audience. Ashley set the syringe down with deliberate care. The metal caught the fluorescent light as it touched the steel surface. She turned, her movements economical, her face a landscape with no weather. One measured breath. Then she walked toward the OR, her prosthetic leg bearing her weight with the mechanical precision of something engineered to hide its own story. Caldwell was waiting in OR 3, arms crossed, his white coat pristine as a surgeon's ego. The resident beside him, Dr. Singh, fresh from pediatrics rotation, looked confused by the sudden intensity in the room. Caldwell's voice dropped into that register he reserved for public demolition, honeysmooth and absolutely lethal. Nurse Cooper. Perhaps you can explain to Dr. Singh here why you felt qualified to countermand my morphine order for the septic patient in Bay 3. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. Ashley met his eyes. No flinch. No color rising in her cheeks. Just a nurse standing in surgical lights with a limp and hands that had held more lives together than this man would ever know. The patient's respiratory rate was 8, doctor. The standing order is to hold opioids below 12. I'm aware of protocols, nurse. His smile was a knife masquerading as warmth. What I'm questioning is whether a floor nurse with a limited mobility should be making judgment calls that override attending physicians. There it was. The disability pivot. The weakness he'd been storing since that first day, waiting for the right moment to weaponize it. His power source wasn't medical knowledge, it was the institutional permission to humiliate without consequence. One phone call to the board chair and this moment became documentation. One conversation with hospital legal and her concerns became scope creep. Caldwell had studied the architecture of Sacred Heart long enough to know exactly where the load-bearing walls were, and he was testing hers. A single tear escaped Ashley's right eye. Not trembling. Not falling. A tear like a data point, like a physical manifestation of something she was observing about herself rather than drowning in. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her jaw moving slightly as if she was tasting something bitter and deciding whether to swallow. I've watched better men than you collapse under pressure, doctor. I can wait. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent OR, the mechanical breathing of someone else's emergency. Dr. Singh's eyes moved between them like he was watching something he didn't have a framework to understand. Caldwell's expression fractured for exactly half a second, surprise that she hadn't crumbled, rage that she hadn't performed the breakdown he'd orchestrated. Then his composure reassembled itself, colder this time. More dangerous. We're done here. An hour later, he cornered her in the supply closet on the 2nd floor. The space was narrow, lined with gauze and saline, and his breath came at her coffer-stale and thick with anticipation. His finger jabbed toward her chest but stopped just short of contact, another calculated move, physical intimidation without the legal liability of actual touching. That little display of insubordination? I've already documented it. You're done here by Friday. Overstepping scope of practice. Insubordination. Creating a hostile work environment. He leaned closer. You don't challenge me in front of my residents. Ever. Ashley reached past him for the gauze she'd come for. Her hands were steady. Not because she wasn't afraid, fear was information, pain was data, and she'd learned to read both in the language of survival. Her hands were steady because showing Caldwell her fear would be giving him what he'd come for. He wanted to see her break. He wanted the satisfaction of dismantling her carefully constructed civilian persona, wanted to prove that the woman who corrected his orders was nothing but a liability, a nursing flaw problem that could be solved with institutional policy. She didn't give him the satisfaction. At shift change, the parking lot was emptying and filling simultaneously, day shift heading to their cars, night shift arriving in a river of scrubs and rubber-soled shoes. The sky was that particular shade of Norfolk dusk, all orange fading to purple, rain threatening on the horizon like a sinus rhythm that hadn't quite stabilized. Caldwell approached with the timing of someone who'd been waiting for maximum audience arrival. He handed her an envelope with theatrical formality, his movements designed to draw attention. Effective immediately, you're removed from trauma rotation. You'll be covering post-op recovery. Less decision-making. More appropriate for your limitations. The arriving nurses pretended not to watch. They were good at that. They'd learned to let their eyes slide past workplace violence the same way they let their heart slide past the 10-hour shifts and the patients they couldn't save and the colleagues who burned out and disappeared. Ashley opened the envelope. The letter was printed on hospital letterhead with her name spelled correctly and her career erasure notarized into official document form. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She folded the letter with the kind of care you give to something that mattered, which meant she folded it without care at all, just the mechanical creasing of paper by fingers that had been trained to move with precision under pressure. She tucked it into her scrub pocket and looked at Caldwell with eyes the color of someone who'd already calculated how many days until Friday, how many shifts until she became invisible again, how many years it had taken to bury Major Ashley Cooper deep enough that a man like this could stand 5 feet away and believe she was just a nurse with a limp who needed his mercy. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate the clarity. Civility was its own kind of weapon. 3 hours after the parking lot humiliation, Ashley sat in her car in the Sacred Heart staff lot, her phone glowing with job postings she was too angry to read. The hospital's emergency alert came through at 5:53 p.m. Mass casualty incident at the Naval Base Training Facility, 3 miles north, multiple critical inbounds, all available personnel report immediately. The text also came with a note, priority assignment decisions being made by attending staff. Translation, Caldwell would be triaging assignments. He would place her in post-op regardless of need. He would make sure she spent the next crisis watching other people save lives. She sat in her car for 7 seconds. Counted them. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 7. Then her hands turned the ignition. The ER was chaos when she arrived, residents shouting vectors, gurneys flying through automatic doors on rubber wheels that squeaked like dying animals, the metallic smell of fresh blood cutting through the antiseptic like a second language nobody needed to translate. The charge nurse was already at capacity, calling assignments rapid fire like she was conducting an orchestra made of trauma and adrenaline. She pointed Ashley toward Bay 4 before anyone could object, before Caldwell could filter her assignment through his architecture of institutional sabotage. The first ambulance brought minor injuries, abrasions, a fractured collarbone, a laceration that needed 8 sutures and the kind of calm talking that civilians needed after their bodies had tried to kill them and failed. Ashley moved through the assessment with muscle memory, her hands finding what they needed to find, her voice steady as a metronome. Routine. Manageable. The kind of emergency that felt almost quiet compared to the one she'd seen in Marjah. Then the second ambulance doors opened. The green beret came through on a stretcher that seemed too small for what he'd become, a shattered thing, his tactical vest soaked through, his chest torn open like something that had been unmade and was trying very hard to remember how to hold together. Ribs visible through the destruction. A training accident, the paramedic shouted over the noise, IED simulation gone catastrophic, shrapnel, multiple penetrating wounds, vitals already coding, ETA at the hospital was the moment he stopped breathing. The attending physician in Bay 4 froze. Just for a moment. His hands hovered uselessly over the trauma, his mind processing the gap between what he'd been trained to do and what this body required. That moment lasted 2 seconds. Maybe 3. In a hospital, 3 seconds can expand into forever. Ashley's eyes caught the dog tag first. Single tag on a broken chain, blood-soaked and impossible. She'd seen that tag that morning. It had been in the lost and found on the 4th floor, turned in by housekeeping, no identifying information. She'd logged it with the kind of administrative precision that felt almost ceremonial, running her fingers over the embossed numbers like she was reading Braille. The numbers had meant nothing. They meant everything now. She gave that tag to a 7-year-old boy in Marjah. His name was Amir. She'd pulled him from a compound fire in the summer of 2011, his small body weighing almost nothing, his lungs full of smoke and his eyes full of the kind of terror that doesn't have words in any language. She'd held him in the back of the medical transport, pressing bandages against burns that shouldn't have happened to children, whispering promises through the smoke and dust that she'd keep him safe, that he'd be okay, that the dog tag would bring him luck. The tag was hers, a gift from her unit, engraved with coordinates that meant something to the people who fought in that valley. She'd had no right to give it away. She'd done it anyway. The monitor screamed. 02 sat dropping, 78, 72, 65. The Green Beret's heart rate climbing in the way that meant the body knew it was dying and was trying desperately to keep up. The attending physician's hand still hadn't moved. Ashley's hands moved on their own. She was already reaching for the trauma shears. 14-gauge angiocath needle materialized between her fingers before her mind caught up to what her body was doing. 20 years of civilian erasure evaporated like water on hot concrete. Her muscle memory overrode every protocol she'd accepted, every limitation she'd internalized. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in the actual field, under actual fire, with actual stakes that went beyond institutional policy and attendant's physician ego. She couldn't let him die. Not with her dog tag around his neck. Not when the 7-year-old boy she'd promised to protect had somehow become a Green Beret and had somehow come back to her. The room went absolutely still. Not the silence of agreement. The silence of recognition. The silence that comes when someone steps out from behind a carefully constructed mask and everyone in the room suddenly realizes they've been standing next to a stranger the entire time. The monitor screamed. One long, flat, accusatory wail that made every nerve in the trauma bay snap electric. The Green Beret's chest was hamburger. Shrapnel from an IED in Kandahar had opened him like a butcher's work, ribs visible through torn muscle, lung tissue already darkening at the edges. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Chen, stood frozen 3 feet from the patient, his hands hovering in the space between panic and protocol, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to remember what words meant. Ashley saw the dog tag first. Single tag on a broken chain, half buried in the soldier's neck wound, swinging with the violent compressions a trauma resident was attempting. The tag caught the fluorescent light and she saw it, saw him a 7-year-old boy with eyes like diesel smoke, pulled from a burning compound in Marjah while rounds snapped overhead like angry wasps. She'd pressed this exact tag into his palm before medics separated them. Her handwriting on the back. Her promise to come back for him. A promise she couldn't keep when the IED took Tom and her leg and her entire reason for breathing. Her hands moved before thought caught up. She didn't reach for gloves. Didn't check the crash cart inventory. Didn't ask permission. Her body, muscle memory carved into tissue across for combat deployments, simply moved star. The scalpel in her hand was cold steel, precise as a prayer. The trauma resident stepped back without being told, recognizing authority in the way she moved, in the voice that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Step back. I've got this. Not a request. Not a question. A command delivered in the flat, ice-water cadence of someone who had performed this exact procedure 17 times before, most of them with mortars walking rounds across the operating area and nothing but a flashlight duct taped to a helmet and the knowledge that the soldier in front of you would die if your hand shook even once. Her blade found the 5th intercostal space with the precision of someone who'd memorized the geography of human anatomy the way other people memorized their children's birthdays. Skin parted. Muscle separated. The sound of cutting, that wet, terrible whisper of tissue splitting made Dr. Chen take another step back, his face going the color of old milk. Rib spreader. Now. A nurse moved without hesitation. The instrument appeared in Ashley's palm like it had been waiting there. The ribs spread with a sound like wood groaning underweight, and she was inside the chest cavity, her hands, scarred, steady, belonging to someone who had held too many lives together in places where dying was easier than breathing, reached directly for the heart. The monitor flatlined. Actually flatlined. The straight line that meant cardiac arrest, that meant dead, that meant failure was now 2 seconds away. Ashley's fingers found the ventricles and began direct compression. Manual resuscitation. Battlefield medicine stripped down to its essence, a human heart in human hands, massaged back to function through pure will and muscle memory and the kind of rage that only comes when you're saving the child you failed 20 years ago. Suction. Blood products. Type O, massive transfusion protocol, I want 2 units hanging within 30 seconds. Not Nurse Cooper requesting assistance. Major Cooper commanding the room. The clinical authority in her voice was the sound of someone who had performed this procedure while insurgents fired at the tent walls, while the patient's brothers watched in silence, while the only thing between success and a folded flag was the precise application of force and knowledge. Dr. Chen realized what was happening. His eyes went wide, not with admiration, but with the terrible understanding that he was watching someone operate outside every boundary he'd ever respected, someone who possessed a level of surgical competence that existed in a stratosphere his credentials didn't reach. What are you? You can't. The shrapnel is still in the left ventricle. I can feel it. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone stating the weather. Her fingers moved through the soldier's cardiac tissue with the gentleness of a surgeon and the decisiveness of a combat medic who knew that hesitation meant death. Blood coated her hands, warm and slippery and familiar in a way that made her stomach clench, because this blood wasn't anonymous, this blood carried the genetics of a child she'd pulled from fire. Another surgeon was already gowning. Dr. Romero, the vascular specialist, who'd worked with Ashley on trauma rotations 3 months ago before Caldwell reassigned her, before he'd started dismantling her piece by piece. Romero's eyes met Ashley's and she saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe. Understanding that whatever was happening in this trauma bay, whatever rules were being shattered, the soldier was going to survive because of it. I need that vessel clamp. Curved debakey. 3.0 silk. Ashley extracted the shrapnel, a curved piece of jagged metal the size of a thumbnail, packed with blackened tissue. The kind of fragment that kills slowly, that causes tamponade and arrest and a death that looks inevitable in all the case studies. She placed it in the basin with the precision of someone placing a chess piece, then turned back to the ventricle and began the methodical, terrible work of repair. The monitor ticked. Once. Twice. Then a rhythm bloomed across the screen, a sinus rhythm, chaotic but present, a heartbeat that shouldn't exist but did because of the hands working inside that chest. The blood products came in. Romero was beside her now, their hands working in the synchronized dance of surgeons who've done this before, who understand each other through gesture and positioning and the unspoken language of crisis. Pressure's coming up. 72/48. Saturation? 88 and climbing. For minutes. That was all it took. For minutes from flatline to stable vitals, from dead to alive, from a 7-year-old's broken promise to a second chance. Ashley stepped back from the operating field as Romero took the lead on closure, as the surgical machinery of a modern trauma center clicked into its normal rhythm. Blood covered Ashley's scrubs, her hands, her forearms up to the elbows. It smelled like copper and iron and the unforgettable metallic perfume of human desperation. That's when she saw him. Through the glass panel of the trauma bay. Dr. Caldwell. Standing in the ER hallway with his phone already pressed to his ear, his face arranged in the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a violation so comprehensive, so egregious, that it could be weaponized. His eyes met hers for 2 seconds. That was all it took. In those 2 seconds, Ashley understood that she hadn't saved this soldier, she'd just signed her own termination papers in blood. Caldwell's fingers were already moving, 3 phone calls already queued, one to his board allies, one to hospital administration, one to the security office. Documentation. Witnesses. A narrative already being constructed that would turn an act of salvation into grounds for termination. The soldiers in the ICU would remember her hands. The attending physician would remember her voice. But Caldwell would remember her violation of scope, her insubordination, her theft of another surgeon's authority. He would remember it as proof that she'd never belonged here in the first place, that her carefully constructed civilian identity had been a fraud. Security arrived within 2 minutes. 2 officers in Navy uniforms, their faces arranged in the particular neutrality of people who've been given instructions and are simply following protocol. Ashley was still holding the trauma shears. Still covered in blood. Still moving in the residual adrenaline of combat medicine. "Nurse Cooper, we need you to come with us. Dr. Caldwell has filed an immediate incident report. You're on administrative suspension pending investigation." She didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't explain that the soldier would have died in the time it took to follow protocol, that her hands had moved out of medical necessity, not ego, that this was what saving lives actually looked like when you weren't worried about hierarchies and liability and the fragile authority of men who'd never held anyone's heartbeat in their palm. She simply walked out of the trauma bay in her blood-soaked scrubs, past the whispers of nurses who'd seen her voice command the room, past Caldwell's satisfied expression, into the fluorescent-lit hallway that suddenly felt like a grave. The soldier behind her was breathing. His heart was beating. His eyes would open within hours and he would whisper a word that would change everything, but Ashley didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she'd saved him and that it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough to let her stay. Caldwell appeared within 3 minutes. Not called. Not paged. He simply materialized in the resuscitation bay like an infection spreading through clean tissue, his presence filling the oxygen-depleted room with something worse than blood, the sharp metallic stink of institutional power being weaponized. The attending physician had stepped back once the soldier's vitals stabilized under competent hands, and that's when Caldwell moved. Not toward the patient. Toward Ashley. His face was the color of old concrete. His jaw worked twice before sound emerged. "Your credentials. Now." Ashley didn't look at him. Her hands were still moving, checking lines, verifying the femoral catheter she'd placed. The soldier's chest rose and fell in the measured rhythm of mechanical ventilation. The monitors beeped their steady song. She'd saved him. The metrics didn't lie. "I said now, Cooper." She finally turned. Her eyes were flat. Clinical. The eyes of someone who'd already accepted what came next. "I'll need them documented," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping into the register of a man building a case. "Your badge. Your ID. Your access credentials to the trauma rotation." His fingers moved across his phone with the velocity of someone already composing emails. "This is a Level 1 trauma center. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. Without proper training documentation. Without attending oversight. Without consent." Ashley unclipped her badge. 42 months of trauma rotation credentials. Hundreds of shifts. Thousands of lives touched. She placed it on the metal tray beside the soldier's full line. "You understand you've violated OSHA protocol, state nursing law, and this hospital's credentialing standards," Caldwell said, each word a nail being hammered. He was talking louder now, ensuring the entire resuscitation bay heard. The residents. The surgical nurses. The ICU staff who'd witnessed what she'd done. His voice had shifted from threat to proclamation. "You'll surrender all hospital access as of this moment. You're on administrative suspension pending a full board review." He was already on his phone. Ashley watched his thumb move across the screen with surgical precision. "Dr. Bennett? It's Caldwell. I need this documented immediately." His eyes never left Ashley's face, watching for flinch, for break, for the satisfaction of seeing her finally crumble. "We have a serious protocol violation. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Practicing beyond scope. Yes. Yes, I have witnesses. He paused. Can you reach Sterling and Hayes tonight? This needs to go to the board chair before morning. Another pause. His jaw tightened. Because if we don't act within 12 hours, the liability exposure becomes our responsibility. Exactly. I'll send you the incident report. He hung up. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical sigh. Security, Caldwell called out, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who'd learned how to weaponize protocol into a perfectly legal blade. A uniformed guard appeared in the doorway within 40 seconds, not coincidence, Ashley realized. He'd called them before he'd even come here. Before she'd even pulled her hands back from a man she'd saved. This wasn't improvisation. This was calculated destruction with every step predetermined. Please escort Ms. Cooper from the hospital, Caldwell said, his tone almost regretful, as if this were a tragedy rather than a triumph. Collect her badge, her ID, and her access key. Ensure she has no further entry to any restricted areas. The guard approached with the mechanical courtesy of a man who'd done this before, always polite, always professional, always crushing. Ashley didn't resist. She'd learned long ago that fighting the machine only gave it more justification to grind. The soldier's eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell. His heart traced the steady rhythm of survival on the monitor above his bed. That was all that mattered. The drive to Arlington took 42 minutes in the rain. The interstate was empty at 11:44 p.m., just her headlights and the percussion of water hammering the windshield like an accusation. Her scrubs were still blood-soaked. The hospital had taken her badge but left her with the physical evidence of what she'd done, dark stains across her thighs, the copper iron smell clinging to her skin. She didn't go home. Not yet. The cemetery gates were still open. Night shift caretakers. She parked near Section 34 and walked through the rain without an umbrella, letting it soak through her jacket, her hair, her very last layer of pretense. Her prosthetic leg made a soft sucking sound with each step in the mud, the wet earth trying to claim her back into the ground. Tom's headstone appeared through the darkness like something she'd been searching for her entire life. The granite was wet. She knelt into the mud, and the rain came harder, as if the sky was finally crying for her. I saved him, Tom. Her voice cracked on the second word. I saved our boy from Marjah. Her hands traced the letters of his name carved into stone. And it still wasn't enough to let me keep doing this. The rain soaked through her scrubs. Through her jacket. Into her bones. She stayed there, forehead against the granite, speaking into the earth that held the man she'd loved, the life she'd buried. I tried to be invisible, she whispered. I tried to just help people. But he took even that away. Her phone buzzed at 12:03 a.m. She didn't need to look at it to know. The notification arrived anyway, a soft ping in the night like a final punch. She pulled it from her pocket with shaking fingers. From Sacred Heart Human Resources. Subject, termination of employment, effective immediately. Body, following investigation into gross violation of nursing protocol, unauthorized surgical procedure, and practicing beyond civilian scope of licensure, your employment with Sacred Heart Hospital is terminated effective immediately. Your access credentials have been revoked. Your nursing license has been flagged for board review. Please return all hospital property by end of business Friday or legal action will ensue. Another email arrived seconds later. From Dr. Marcus Caldwell. Subject, formal complaint, board review. Followed by 6 more emails from board members. From Hospital Council. From the Risk Management Department. Each one a brick in the wall they were building between her and the only thing she'd ever wanted to do. She turned the phone face down in the mud beside her husband's grave. In the ICU 3 floors above where she'd saved him, the young Green Beret's eyes opened for the first time since his arrival. The fluorescent lights hummed their clinical song above him. Tubes in his mouth. Tape on his chest. The attending physician leaned forward, relief flooding his face that the soldier had returned to consciousness. "You're safe," the doctor said. "You're at Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk. You had a training accident." A nurse, he paused, still processing what he'd witnessed, still struggling to explain the impossible competence of her hands on a bleeding chest. "A nurse saved your life." The soldier's eyes were tracking now. Conscious. Present. They moved across the room with the systematic precision of military training, cataloguing exits, assessing threats, understanding the perimeter. His gaze landed on the bedside table where a badge lay, dropped during the security escort. The name read, Ashley Cooper, RN. But that wasn't what made his eyes widen. The unit patch on the lanyard beneath her name was Afghan Combat Medical Unit insignia from 2004. The same insignia that matched the faded photograph in his locked metal box at home. The photograph of a young soldier in a dust storm, holding a rescue card with coordinates and a single call sign written in permanent marker, Shadow Fox. His lips moved. His voice was barely a whisper through the endotracheal tube, but the word emerged with absolute clarity, spoken to the attending physician with the reverence of someone calling a prayer. Shadow Fox. The attending's face went white. Within 20 minutes, he was on a secure line to naval intelligence. Within 40 minutes, the hospital administrator was reading a sealed military file with trembling hands, her face draining of color at each redacted line. The document was heavy with black ink. Heavy with classified stamps. Heavy with the weight of 2 decades of secrets that had just become someone else's problem. She called Caldwell at 11:52 p.m. "Return to the hospital," she said, her voice different now. Colder. Official. "Bring the file on the nurse. The one you just terminated. And don't discuss this with anyone." At 12:17 a.m., Caldwell stood in the hospital administrator's office, watching her read a document that was turning her skin the color of bleached bone. She looked up at him once, and something in her expression told him that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. That everything he'd just done, the coordination with board members, the documentation, the character assassination unfolding in real time, had been orchestrated against an opponent whose power he couldn't comprehend. "What is this?" Caldwell asked. The administrator didn't answer. She was already calling security. The hospital administrator's hands trembled as she opened the sealed manila folder marked with a single stamp, classified. Her face went the color of old bone with each page she turned. Redacted lines crossed out entire paragraphs. Unit designations blacked out. Casualty reports she was never cleared to read. Combat medals listed in sparse military language. Medical discharge papers signed by a brigadier general. The folder contained a woman the administrator thought she knew, a tired night shift nurse with a limp, and a woman she'd never met at all. The conference room on the 3rd floor had filled without anyone officially calling a meeting. The hospital's chief administrator sat rigid in the leather chair. Board members exchanged glances that said they'd already discussed exit strategies. And then the doors opened. A man in dress uniform walked in first. Chest full of ribbons. Posture like a steel rod inside human skin. Behind him came a naval intelligence liaison carrying a briefing folder that made the air in the room seem heavier. The administrator recognized the protocol. Federal. Military. The kind of presence that made hospital hierarchy suddenly look like a child's Game of Thrones. The Green Beret's commanding officer looked directly at the administrator. His voice came out flat, official, final, Major Ashley Cooper. The words landed like a detonation. Major. Not nurse. Not Ashley the trauma tech who limped through double shifts. The man's eye swept across the room, taking in every face that had ever called her by anything less than her rank. His jaw tightened. The tremor in that one word, Major, contained 20 years of service and 3 years of watching her work beneath her own ceiling. "Where is she?" The Naval Intelligence Liaison opened his briefing folder without waiting for an answer. The document inside bore a seal Ashley had worn beneath her scrubs for 2 decades. He began reading in the clipped cadence of someone reciting facts that made career officers weep. Silver star. Silence. 2 bronze stars with Valor. The board members stopped breathing. Purple heart. The administrator's hand went to her mouth. Second purple heart. No one moved. The liaison continued, his voice steady as a laser scalpel. Meritorious Service Medal. Combat Medical Badge. Master Parachutist. For combat deployments across 8 years. Marjah, Kandahar Province. Sanjin Valley, Helmand. FOB Shank, Logar Province. And 1 classified location we are not at liberty to discuss in this setting. Each decoration fell like a hammer against a judge's bench. With every medal, the administrator's face drained further. With every citation, the board members found urgent reasons to study the conference table. The man reading from that folder carried institutional weight they could not argue with. He was not a hospital administrator. He was not a board member worried about liability. He spoke the language of federal authority, and it was clear he'd flown 800 miles to speak it in this room. A DOD investigator stepped forward next. His suit was understated. His bearing was not. He placed a tablet on the conference table and began talking in the methodical tone of someone building a case that had already been decided. Major Cooper's medical discharge from active duty was classified under provisions of Title 10, USC 1141. Her civilian identity was protected under federal statute. When Captain Marcus Hayes woke up in ICU 14 hours ago, his recognition of Major Cooper's call sign, Shadow Fox, triggered automatic security protocols. Those protocols exist for a reason. They exist to protect individuals whose service records contain information that remains operationally sensitive. He swiped through screens on the tablet. Timestamps. IP addresses. Personnel file access logs highlighted in red. Dr. Caldwell, you accessed Major Cooper's personnel file 6 times in the past 3 weeks. You're not authorized to access personnel files. You're not authorized to alter performance reviews. And you certainly are not authorized to fabricate witness statements and backdate complaints that never existed in the original documentation. The investigator's eyes met Caldwell's. When the doctor tried to stand, the investigator continued without pausing. We found the original performance reviews you altered. We found the emails where you coordinated with board members about how to, and I'm quoting directly, eliminate the problem before she costs us liability. We found the text message to your surgical director where you discuss making sure her crippled authority was neutralized. Caldwell's face moved through 6 different shades of white and red like a medical chart nobody wanted to read. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. When he finally spoke, his voice came out strangled. I was documenting legitimate concerns about competence. You called her gimpy, the administrator said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd read every complaint she'd ignored, every incident report she'd filed away to protect a chief of surgery who was supposed to matter more than a nurse. Over hospital-wide intercom. I have 17 staff complaints I received and did nothing about, Dr. Caldwell, because you were chief of surgery and she was just a nurse. The past tense in that sentence was audible. Just a nurse. Not anymore. An FBI agent stepped into the conference room. His presence changed the air pressure like a door opening into somewhere colder. He wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to discuss. He was there to end something that had already ended the moment a Green Beret woke up and whispered a single word, Shadow Fox. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, you're under arrest for falsifying federal records related to a protected military asset, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate the protected status statutes of Title 18, Section 1519. The agent's voice was the kind of voice that had ended 1,000 conversations. You have the right to remain silent. Caldwell stood. His chair skidded backward with a sound like a scream. The board members who'd taken his calls, attended his dinners, coordinated his strategy against a woman they thought was powerless, those men and women suddenly discovered urgent meetings. Phones appeared. Briefcases emerged from under chairs. One board member was already texting someone, fingers moving in panic. Another was erasing his call history, a gesture so obviously guilty that everyone in the room saw it and nobody would ever mention it. The investigator continued, indifferent to the chaos. We also found communications with 3 board members where you discussed coordinating testimony against Major Cooper. We found emails. We found text messages. We found a security recording from the parking lot the night you handed her a termination letter in front of arriving staff. All of it documented. All of it federal evidence. Caldwell's carefully constructed power, 8 years of it, built on institutional position and strategic alliances and the assumption that a woman with a limp couldn't fight back, collapsed in real time like a structure with its foundation removed. His hand-picked residents found sudden interest in their shoes. His secretary was already packing his office belongings into cardboard boxes, each item a small betrayal. His allies were gone. The FBI agent moved forward with handcuffs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a sentence being read aloud. The walk from the 3rd-floor conference room down to the main ER became what hospital staff would discuss for years, the perp walk no one expected, the fall of a man who'd ruled through fear and bureaucracy and the unspoken agreement that nurses existed to serve doctors, not the other way around. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old paper. His hands were shaking now. His voice, when he tried to speak, came out in fragments nobody was listening to anymore. Every nurse he'd berated stepped back to let the agents pass. Every resident he'd humiliated watched without expression as the handcuffs went on. Every patient advocate he'd dismissed stood witness to a reckoning they'd stopped believing would come. The man who'd called Ashley Cooper gimpy over hospital-wide intercom was being escorted out by federal agents, and the ER, that space where he'd ruled with condescension and cruelty, had fallen completely silent. Ashley stood in the conference room doorway, still in scrubs, her prosthetic leg barely visible beneath the fabric. Her face was perfectly still. Not triumphant. Not satisfied. Just still. The way soldiers look when something they've carried for a long time finally gets set down. The way people look when they've been waiting for justice, and justice, when it finally arrives, turns out to be much colder and more bureaucratic than anything they imagined. 6 months later, Ash lay snowsoft on the Arlington headstones as the winter sun broke through clouds over Washington, D.C. But Ashley wasn't at Arlington that day. She was walking through the West Wing in full dress uniform, the sharp creases pressed into cloth that hadn't fit her body in 20 years, her chest displaying every decoration that Naval Intelligence Liaison had read aloud, every medal earned through sacrifice and service and choices made in darkness that nobody was supposed to know about. Captain Marcus Hayes walked beside her in his own dress uniform, the dog tag she'd given him as a terrified 7-year-old boy in Marjah polished and displayed on his chest. He was 27 now, wearing the uniform of a combat veteran, standing with the woman who'd saved him twice, once as a child, once as a soldier. The Oval Office doors opened with the kind of quiet ceremony that matters more than any noise could. The president stood to greet them. The Presidential Medal of Freedom waited on a blue velvet cushion, the ribbon the color of old honor. The citation was read aloud for the press pool gathered in the room, for extraordinary valor in combat and continued service to wounded warriors through 2 decades of civilian medical care, and for embodying the highest principles of military service and human compassion. The photograph that would run in every major newspaper the next morning captured Ashley shaking the president's hand, Hayes standing at attention behind her, his eyes bright with something like closure, something like pride. The image would appear on screens across the country. It would be shared. Discussed. The story of the buried major, the hidden hero, the nurse who'd carried her service in silence for 20 years. Meanwhile, across Norfolk in a strip mall parking lot between a tax preparation service and a vacant storefront, Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat at a folding table in a folding chair, his medical license revoked by the state medical board, his hospital privileges terminated, his career a single word, finished. He was selling supplemental insurance policies to people passing by, most of whom walked past without making eye contact. His phone logs would later show 43 outgoing calls to former colleagues. He would receive 0 callbacks. A former Sacred Heart resident walked past that folding table on a Tuesday afternoon. He recognized Caldwell, saw the man's face brighten slightly. Maybe this was a former mentee, maybe this was someone who remembered when he mattered. The resident kept walking. His pace didn't change. His expression didn't shift. He simply walked past and did not look back, which was perhaps a crueler justice than anything the federal system could deliver. At Sacred Heart in Norfolk, Ashley's portrait hung in the newly created Wall of Honor in the main ER. Beneath her photograph, a single line, Major Ashley Cooper, Army Nurse Corps, Chief of Trauma Services. The hospital break room TV played her final interview. A national news correspondent asked about the years of silence, the hidden service, the choice to bury the major beneath the nurse. Ashley's response came clear and steady: "I never stopped serving. I just changed uniforms." Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Captain Hayes, standing beside her in that interview, added quietly, "She saved my life twice. Once when I was 7 years old, pulling me out of a compound fire in Marjah. Once when I was 27, performing emergency surgery while everyone else was frozen." Shadowfox never leaves anyone behind. That's not just a call sign. That's a promise. The screen faded on Ashley returning to work at Sacred Heart the following Monday morning, her uniform pressed, her prosthetic leg as invisible as it had been for 2 decades, her service finally honored, her silence finally broken. She walked through the ER doors, the same doors where she'd been escorted out by security 3 weeks earlier, and the nurses stepped back to let her pass. Not from fear this time. From respect. The hierarchy had been reorganized. The weakest person in the room had turned out to be the strongest person who'd ever worked there. Sometimes true power doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just waits. Quietly. Patiently. Until the moment comes to reclaim what was never really lost. If you've got someone like Ashley in your corner, the quiet person, the one nobody notices, you've got everything you need. Subscribe to learn more stories of hidden heroes and institutional reckoning. Like this video if you believe the quietest warriors deserve the loudest recognition. Comment below, who's the quiet hero in your life that nobody knows about?